The evening air in downtown London was cold enough to make every breath visible. Streetlights glowed softly on the wet pavement, and the city's usual noise had quieted into a calm rhythm of footsteps and distant traffic. Edward Grant, a billionaire known for his sharp mind and busier schedule, walked out of his towering glass office building, his thoughts still buried in numbers and meetings. His driver waited nearby, but before he could step into the car, a young tourist approached him, holding a crumpled map and speaking quickly in French. Edward tried to help, but his limited knowledge of the language turned his words into a jumble of confusion. The tourist looked even more lost than before, and Edward, slightly embarrassed, gave an awkward smile. Just then, from the corner of the street, a soft but confident voice spoke. "Would you like me to translate that?" The interruption was so unexpected that Edward turned immediately. Standing a few steps away was a woman in a faded coat and worn-out shoes, her hair tucked under a hood. Her face was pale from the cold, and her blanket was barely enough to keep her warm. Yet her eyes sharp, intelligent, and calm caught Edward's attention before anything else. Without waiting for permission, she walked closer and began speaking to the tourist in perfect French, her tone fluid and natural, like a melody Edward couldn't understand but somehow felt. The tourist's face brightened instantly as she gave clear directions with effortless charm. Within moments, the man thanked her warmly and left, his smile full of gratitude. Edward, however, remained frozen in place, staring at the stranger who had appeared from nowhere and handled the situation as if she had lived in 5 countries at once. For a moment, he forgot the chill in the air. "That was impressive," he finally said, his voice softer than usual. The woman gave a faint smile but said nothing. Her eyes held a quiet humility, the kind that belongs to someone who has seen both comfort and hardship. Edward looked at her closely now, the way her blanket was torn, the way she stood with dignity, despite everything about her screaming of struggle. "You speak French?" he asked, almost not believing his own question. "And Spanish," she replied gently. "Also Italian, German, and Japanese." Her tone was calm, without pride, almost like she was listing something ordinary. Edward blinked in surprise. A homeless woman who spoke 5 languages? It sounded impossible. He wanted to ask more, but something about her expression stopped him. She seemed distant, cautious, as if she had grown used to people staring at her and walking away. Before he could say another word, she pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked toward the busy road. "It's getting cold," she whispered, her breath forming a mist in the air. "Have a good evening, sir." Then, just like that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of people rushing past. Edward stood still for a few seconds, unsure what had just happened. He was a man who built empires, who made deals worth millions every day, but at that moment, he felt strangely small. His mind couldn't let go of the image of her calm face and fluent words. Who was she? How could someone like her, clearly educated, refined, and full of grace, end up on the streets? The thought refused to leave him as he finally sat inside his car. While the city lights blurred past the window, Edward's mind replayed the scene over and over. Her voice, her confidence, the way she handled the tourist with ease, it all felt unreal. He even found himself smiling slightly, though he didn't know why. When he reached home, he poured himself a drink but left it untouched. For the first time in years, his thoughts were not about his business, his next meeting, or his company's future. They were about a stranger with a blanket and the gift of 5 languages. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words echoed in his mind. "Would you like me to translate that?" It was a simple question, yet it carried something deeper, something that stirred a feeling he couldn't name. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps guilt, or maybe admiration. Edward didn't know it yet, but this small, unexpected encounter on a cold London evening was about to change everything he thought he knew about life, success, and the people the world often overlooks. Edward watched the woman, as the tourist disappeared into the distance. Still amazed at what he had just witnessed, the cold wind brushed against his face, but for a moment, he didn't feel it. His eyes remained fixed on the woman who stood before him, calm, quiet, and somehow mysterious. "You speak French?" he asked, his tone a mix of surprise and curiosity. She gave a faint, almost shy smile, and replied softly, "In Spanish, Italian, German, and Japanese." The words left Edward speechless. A homeless woman, standing under a flickering streetlight, claiming to know 5 languages fluently. It sounded unbelievable. Edward had met professors, diplomats, and scholars, but none had ever spoken with such effortless confidence. For a man who ruled boardrooms and dealt with world leaders, it was rare for him to be caught off guard. Yet here he was, unable to find a single intelligent thing to say. He studied her face beneath the weariness. There was something unmistakable, intelligence, grace, and a quiet strength that years of hardship had failed to erase. Her posture wasn't one of someone defeated by life. Instead, it carried the faint memory of dignity, long lost, but never forgotten. Something in Edward stirred, not pity, but intrigue. Without another word, he gestured toward the small cafe across the street. "Would you let me buy you something warm?" he asked. She hesitated, clutching her blanket tighter, as if unsure whether to trust him. For a few seconds, her eyes flickered with doubt, then softened. "Just coffee," she said finally. Inside the cafe, the warmth was comforting, and Edward watched as she sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. "May I know your name?" he asked. She hesitated again, as though saying it might bring back something painful. "Maria," she said quietly. The name suited her, simple, gentle, and elegant. They sat in silence for a moment until Edward leaned forward slightly. "You said you speak 5 languages? How did you learn them?" She took a slow sip, her gaze distant, lost somewhere between memory and regret. "Once, I taught languages at a university," she said finally, her voice fragile but steady. Edward blinked in disbelief. "You were a professor?" She nodded faintly, a shadow crossing her expression. "Yes. Life used to be very different. I had a home, students, dreams, everything." She paused, her fingers tightening around the cup. "But life? It changed faster than I could keep up." The way she said it, quiet yet full of weight, made Edward feel a lump form in his throat. He wanted to ask what had happened, but something in her tone told him not to. There was pain in her words, the kind that time doesn't easily heal. He noticed her eyes, beautiful, deep, and tired, the kind that had seen too much, yet refused to stop seeing beauty in the world. "What made it change?" he asked carefully. Maria smiled faintly, though it was more sad than happy. "Loss," she whispered. "Sometimes you lose one thing, and then another, and before you realize it, you've lost everything." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Edward didn't know how to respond. He had spent his life solving problems with money, but this was something money couldn't fix. He watched her quietly as she sipped her coffee, each small movement filled with quiet grace. Despite the worn clothes and rough hands, she carried herself like a woman who once belonged to another world. "You must think it's strange," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Someone like me speaking all those languages?" Edward shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "I think it's extraordinary." For the first time, she looked at him fully, her eyes meeting his. There was gratitude there, but also disbelief, as if kindness was something she hadn't seen in years. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping softly against the glass, and the city lights shimmered on the wet streets. The moment felt fragile, like a secret between 2 strangers brought together by chance. Edward wanted to know more, how she ended up here, why someone so brilliant had fallen through the cracks of society, but he held his curiosity, afraid of breaking the delicate trust that was forming. Instead, He said gently, "You know, Maria, sometimes life changes fast, but sometimes it can change again, in ways we don't expect." She gave him a small, distant smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said quietly, "I stopped expecting a long time ago." Her words sank deep into his chest. Edward didn't know it then, but this simple meeting, a billionaire and a homeless linguist sharing coffee on a rainy night, would soon lead to something far greater than either of them imagined. There was more to Maria than her tattered blanket and soft voice. Behind those weary eyes was a story waiting to be told, a story that would soon change both their lives forever. Maria sat quietly across from Edward, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup, as if it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the present moment. The cafe was quiet, filled only with the faint hum of soft music and the occasional clinking of cups. Outside, rain streaked down the glass, blurring the city lights into a watercolor of gold and gray. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice calm but distant. "My name is Maria Lopez," she said. The sound of her name seemed to carry a weight of stories untold. Edward leaned slightly forward, listening with a curiosity that went beyond simple interest. There was something in her tone, a mixture of grace and grief, that made him want to know everything. Maria continued, "A few years ago, I had a different life. I taught languages at a university. I had students, a husband, a home filled with books and laughter." She smiled faintly, though her eyes didn't shine. "I loved what I did. I believed words could connect people who had nothing else in common." Edward watched her carefully, noticing how her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, not from the cold anymore, but from the fragile act of remembering. "My husband, Daniel, was a journalist," she went on. "He loved traveling and telling stories of people who were forgotten by the world. He always said that every person carries a library within them. You just have to ask the right question to open it." Her voice softened. "He was my best friend." For a moment, she stopped talking. The silence between them was heavy, yet neither of them wanted to fill it. Edward could sense the storm behind her calm eyes. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "One day, he went to cover a story abroad and never came back. A car accident. They said it was quick, but grief never is." Edward's chest tightened. He had lost business partners, seen financial crashes, but loss like that, the kind that takes a piece of your soul, was something he could never imagine. Maria stared at the coffee cup, tracing the rim with her finger. "After that, everything started to crumble. I couldn't focus on teaching. Bills piled up. I sold the house, thinking it would be temporary, but temporary things have a way of becoming permanent." She gave a sad, distant smile. "And then, one day, I just stopped trying to fix it." Edward said nothing. He didn't want to interrupt the rhythm of her story. "I ended up here," she continued, her voice steadier now. "The streets became my classroom, the people my new students. I learned about survival, about silence, about kindness that shows up in the smallest ways. Despite everything, I never stopped learning. Books became my home. Words kept me alive." She looked out the window, eyes reflecting the rain. "I found old novels in secondhand stores, sometimes in languages I didn't even know yet. I read until I understood them. Every new language was a door, and I kept opening them, maybe because I was afraid of being locked out of the world completely." Her confession struck Edward deeply. He had always measured intelligence by degrees and success by wealth, but this woman, with nothing but her mind and determination, had accomplished more than he ever could. There was no bitterness in her voice, only quiet strength. It humbled him. For a man used to commanding rooms, negotiating with power, and controlling outcomes, he now sat in front of someone who had lost everything, and yet seemed freer than most people he knew. "You must have been a remarkable teacher," Edward finally said, his tone low and sincere. Maria gave a small smile, her eyes softening. I tried to be, but life has its own lessons. Some of them you can't find in books. The cafe lights flickered slightly as a gust of wind brushed against the windows. Edward looked at her and saw not a homeless woman, but a survivor, someone whose pain had carved wisdom instead of bitterness. He felt an ache in his chest, not of pity, but deep respect. Maria was living proof that a person's worth had nothing to do with where they slept at night. For the first time in years, Edward didn't think about money, work, or reputation. He just listened, really listened, to a woman who had fallen and still found beauty in words. When Maria finally looked back at him, her eyes held a faint spark of hope. You know, she said softly, when you lose everything, you start seeing what truly matters. People, kindness, stories, and maybe second chances. Edward nodded, unable to speak. Something about her words touched a part of him he didn't even know existed. He didn't understand why yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This was not the last time he would see Maria Lopez. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual, his mind still replaying Maria's story from the night before. Something about her had stayed with him, her voice, her quiet strength, the way she spoke of loss without bitterness. He couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting had not been a coincidence. The city was still waking up as he stepped out of his car, near the same corner where he'd first seen her. The air was crisp, and sunlight broke through the gray clouds, reflecting off the wet pavement. For a moment, he wondered if she would even be there. But then, just ahead, he saw her Maria, sitting on a low stone wall, her blanket folded neatly beside her. She wasn't begging or asking for anything. Instead, she was helping a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, who held a crumpled tourist map upside down. No, like this, she said kindly, turning the map around and pointing at the words written in Spanish. The boy laughed as she patiently guided him, explaining the directions in both English and Spanish. Edward stood a few steps away, quietly watching. There was something beautiful in that simple scene, a woman with nothing, giving knowledge like she still had everything. He felt a warmth in his chest, something rare for a man who lived in a world of cold boardrooms and sharp decisions. When the boy waved goodbye and ran off, Maria noticed Edward standing there. Her face showed surprise, maybe even a touch of embarrassment. "You came back," she said softly. "I did," Edward replied, stepping closer. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you told me." She looked down, her hands tightening round the edge of her blanket, unsure what to say. "Maria," Edward began, his tone gentle but serious. "I run a foundation, a place that supports education for children who don't have much. We teach them languages, communication, confidence, things that open doors. I think you could help." Maria's eyes widened slightly. "Me?" she asked, almost whispering. "I've been on the streets for years, Edward. Nobody would take me seriously." He shook his head. "You underestimate yourself. You have more knowledge, more heart, than anyone I've ever met." She gave a small, uncertain laugh, though her eyes glistened with emotion. "I wouldn't even know where to begin," she murmured. Edward smiled softly. "Begin where you left off. I'm not offering you charity, Maria," he said with quiet conviction. "I'm offering you a classroom again." His words seemed to hang in the air, soft but powerful. Maria stared at him, her eyes filling slowly with tears she tried to hide. She had dreamed of teaching again, but it always felt impossible, like a dream too far to reach. "Why me?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. "Because you never stopped being a teacher," Edward said. "You may have lost your home, your job, everything, but not who you are. I saw that yesterday when you spoke 5 languages without hesitation, and I see it again now, helping that little boy." For a long moment, Maria said nothing. The city moved around them, cars passing, people hurrying, but in that small space, time seemed to pause. She looked at Edward with a mix of disbelief and hope. emotions she hadn't felt in years. "You really think I can do it?" she whispered. "I know you can," Edward replied. His tone left no room for doubt. A single tear slipped down Maria's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, smiling through the ache in her chest. "I don't remember the last time someone believed in me," she said softly. Edward nodded. "Then let's make this the first of many times." Maria exhaled shakily, her heart racing. She thought of the long nights spent reading torn books under dim streetlights, of the loneliness that had become her shadow, of the students she once taught who had looked at her with trust and curiosity. The thought of standing in front of a classroom again filled her with both fear and longing. But as she looked into Edward's kind, steady eyes, she saw no judgment, only belief. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'll try." Edward smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." As they walked together toward his car, Maria glanced once more at the corner where she had spent so many forgotten days. For the first time, it no longer felt like her place. Hope, something she had buried long ago, stirred quietly within her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, tomorrow existed, and that was enough. Months passed, and the chill of that rainy night, when Edward had first met Maria, felt like a distant memory. The woman who once sat on a cold sidewalk now stood each morning in a bright classroom filled with laughter and learning. The foundation's walls were painted with colors and hope, and the air always carried the sound of children repeating new words with joy. Maria stood at the front, chalk in hand, her eyes alive again. She taught not just grammar or pronunciation, but understanding, the kind of communication that connects hearts, not just tongues. When you learn another language, she often told her students, you learn another way to be kind. Her lessons became more than classes. They became moments of inspiration. Children who once feared to speak now greeted her every morning in Spanish, French, or Japanese, their faces glowing with confidence. Teachers at the foundation began to notice the change. Maria had a gift not only for teaching, but for touching lives. Edward visited often, standing quietly at the back of the classroom, watching her work. Every time he saw her smile, every time he heard the children's laughter, he felt a quiet pride. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had turned into something much greater. The woman who once had nothing now gave everything: knowledge, compassion, and the courage to believe again. One evening, as the golden light of sunset filled the foundation hall, Edward approached Maria after class. "How do you feel?" he asked. She looked around the room, her voice soft but full of emotion. "Alive," she said. "For a long time, I forgot how that felt." Her words made him smile, and at that moment, he knew she had found her purpose again. A few months later, Edward received an invitation to speak at a global education conference attended by leaders, educators, and philanthropists from around the world. Without hesitation, he thought of Maria. "You should be the one to speak," he told her. She looked shocked. "Me? I can't," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I teach children, Edward. I'm not meant for grand stages." But Edward shook his head. "You teach something the world has forgotten: humanity. They need to hear you." After much persuasion, she agreed, though her heart raced with nerves. The day of the conference arrived, and the grand hall shimmered with lights and anticipation. Hundreds of people filled the seats: journalists, educators, and even government officials. Behind the stage curtain, Maria stood quietly, dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit Edward's assistant had chosen for her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her notes. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Edward, standing beside her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just be yourself," he said. "Speak from your heart. That's what you've always done." When her name was announced, the applause was polite, curious. No one knew who she was, just a name on the list. But the moment Maria stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere shifted. She took a slow breath, looked out at the sea of faces, and smiled. Then, in a calm and steady voice, she greeted the audience in English. The words flowed naturally, graceful and clear. Without pause, she switched to French, then Spanish, Italian, German, and finally Japanese. Each language rolled off her tongue with warmth and precision, leaving the audience mesmerized. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed on her. Then she spoke again in English, her voice carrying both strength and tenderness. Languages, she said, are not just about words. They are about understanding hearts that speak differently from our own. Sometimes, life brings you down so you can rise where you truly belong. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the applause began, soft at first, then thunderous, echoing through the hall. People stood on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Maria's smile widened, her eyes glistening with emotion. For years, she had been unseen, unheard, but now, the world listened. From the front row, Edward watched her with quiet pride, his heart full. He realized that night that he hadn't just met a homeless woman, all those months ago. He had met courage in its purest form. Maria Lopez was no longer a woman surviving the streets. She was a teacher reborn, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that even the smallest act of faith can light the way for someone to find themselves again. As she left the stage, the applause still roaring behind her, Maria felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had finally returned, not just to teaching, but to life itself.